All right, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We are at the end of our third week of class. So this morning, two topics to cover, two sections to cover, and we are, I think, right on track, which is great. So for the first part this morning, I'd like to finish deforestation. And then we will talk about biodiversity. Biodiversity, of course, is intimately linked with the destruction of habitats and the conversion of forests into other land uses. So there's a very close relationship between deforestation and the loss of species. And so our biological resources really is the focus for this morning. I will get to look at all of your discussions, great or lows, over the weekend. Just a reminder, the other important part of your grade again is the op-ed. The prompt is in the syllabus, the rubric, everything's down in there online. I would be more than happy to talk about the op-ed if you wanted me to after class. Or please feel free to email me over the weekend if you have any questions about the op-ed. Anybody got any general questions or housekeeping stuff before we get going this morning on this Friday? All good. Okay. All right, so let's go back and just pick up where we left off, and let me sort of just try and reiterate a couple of things here as it relates to this unique pattern of deforestation before we move on to look at some global numbers and some regional deforestation issues. The reason why I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this fishbone or herringbone pattern is certainly not to suggest in any way that going into a forest area and clearing out a geometric area, you know, I think yesterday we were talking about an example of 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers, right? Or 100 square kilometers. I'm not suggesting that removing forest like that is in any way good, but the point on this discussion around the herringbone pattern is that when you clear an area like that of, let's say, 100 square kilometers, right, from this 10 by 10 cleared area, yeah, you know, once the forest is gone, that's cleared area and that's destructive. But if you were to clear the equivalent area of cleared forest, right, in other words, the brown area here that is actually deforested, okay, this has a much greater impact in terms of species because of the fragmentation of the forest, right? This patchiness, and species get incredibly disturbed, and overall it's a more destructive or a more impactful form of deforestation. And it is we see this in other parts of the world, but it really was a pattern of deforestation that was unique to Amazonia as these shifting agriculturalists moved out into the forest. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was happy with that and sort of understood the premise behind this pattern of deforestation. Again, the herringbone pattern or the fishbone pattern is a result of shifting agriculture, right? These swidden, slash and burn agriculturalists, short-term cash. They don't own the land, but they keep penetrating deeper and deeper into the forest as they get easier access through these cleared areas. All right, so I just wanted to re-emphasize that or reiterate that. So let's look at a couple of rates here on global deforestation. Again, I know this is one of the topics where, you know, I don't want to throw lots and lots of numbers at you, but I'm trying to give you a sense of the destruction here that we're seeing worldwide. So this is a summary. So the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and various agencies, forest agencies, try and quantify, measure the extent of forest loss every year. They're still looking at the 2019-2020 numbers to try and come up with, you know, more accurate estimates. So this represents the average annual tropical primary forest loss, right? So this is primary undisturbed tropical forest loss worldwide. And it shows the average from 2001 to 2013 here. So we were losing around about 4.3 million hectares per year. Okay. In the last 5 years, at least from 2014 to 2018, that number has increased, okay, to over 4 million hectares per year. So that's the depressing news, right? That's the real concern here, is that the rate of tropical primary forest loss has increased essentially in the last 5 years. That 4 million hectares represents an area the size of Denmark, right? Every single year, that is new tropical primary forest loss. This is not just Amazonia. This is the Amazon, Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. So wherever the tropical forests are, we're losing about an area the size of Denmark, or have been, every year. If that's pretty hard to kind of visualize or contextualize, right? 4.3 million hectares is the equivalent of 8 million Amon Carter fields, okay? So yeah, that's extraordinary. 8 million football fields every year worldwide. And what I've tried to do here, I don't know if you can make this out, but I've tried to sort of draw this regionally here. This is the DFW Metroplex in the center, and this circle on Google Earth. So this is the Windstar Casino here as you go up I-35. So this circle that stretches west of Aledo and east here as you move out towards the lakes and south, down south of Hillsborough, that area is equivalent roughly to about 4 million hectares. That's about the size of Denmark. That's how much tropical, primary, pristine, undisturbed forest we have been losing every year for the last 5 years. Okay, so it's quite an extraordinary amount of land use change and impact on these pristine ecosystems. Okay. Okay, where is this happening? I'm not going to ask you to remember these numbers for any particular country at all, right? But if we just take a step back and try and look at this globally, where are the areas of most concern? Well, it turns out Brazil remains our highest priority, right, in terms of the volume of forest loss. So these are, again, this is tropical primary forest, right? So this is thousands of hectares. So what this is 1,347. So let me contextualize this. I know it's a strange way of looking at it here, because this is how the FAO actually reports the numbers. This is the same as saying 1.347 million hectares. That's an easier way to get your head around it. This is 0.481 million hectares. So that's 481,000 hectares, right? So Brazil is still by far and away the country that loses the most rainforest at the moment. About 3 times higher deforestation rates. Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and you can see this list moving down here. Does that make sense? I know that's an absolute rate of deforestation. When we look at forest loss in terms of percentage, right? So this is just another way to look at it, right? These are the top 10 countries losing the most tropical primary forest as a change from 2017. So this is just a 1-year look, right, at deforestation. And what this really is showing is the intensification, right, of deforestation, right? So in other words, Ghana has seen a 60% increase in the rate of deforestation in just a year, right? Ivory Coast, Papua New Guinea, you can see the other countries here. So there's countries here in the west of Africa that are being deforested for all sorts of reasons that we're about to get to. But I just wanted to give you a geographical picture of what's going on around the world, right? So in terms of the sheer volume of forest loss, we're still losing the most trees in Brazil. In terms of intensification, some of the African countries are well up there. This is a bit of a complicated diagram, so let me just take a minute here to explain what's going on here, because what I want to make the link in this diagram, everybody, is I want to make the link, the explicit link between deforestation and climate, because, you know, after our coffee break, we're going to come back and make that link between deforestation and species. So let's just talk climate for a second. Remember the carbon cycle, right? We are adding 11.5 gigatons or billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere through human activities. Remember, 9.5 of that is through the burning of fossil fuels, and 1.6 billion tons comes from all of this, right? 1.6 billion tons of carbon is added to the atmosphere through deforestation. So what this diagram is showing is the change in annual average CO2 added to the atmosphere by deforestation between the sort of first 10 to 12 years of the 21st century and the last 5 years. So again, this is trying to express the intensification of deforestation, but intensification expressed here in terms of carbon added to the atmosphere, right? So the colors here are percentages, and anything in this dark charcoal color here. So for example, when you look at Guinea or Sierra Leone, right? These countries that are on the western parts of Africa, they are, you know, 474.5%. That's a 400+% increase in deforestation in just the last 5 years, right? These are the countries where we're seeing the most intense forest loss. So yes, Brazil is losing the most forest as an overall total tree loss, but they've seen about a 26% increase in the intensification of deforestation, expressed in terms of the amount of carbon being added to the atmosphere. You can see how these forests in Central Africa and in South and Southeast Asia are really the ones that are truly kind of under enormous pressure and under the gun when it comes to adding carbon to the atmosphere through deforestation. I hope that sort of makes sense. Anybody got any questions on that? Anything seem odd there to you? All good. Okay, let me just highlight a couple of areas here that illustrate this importance before we go on to then talk about some of the underlying reasons. So Madagascar is a remarkable country. I have yet to go there. I don't know if any of you have been to Madagascar, but Madagascar is one of the most biologically important and diverse countries in the world. Obviously, this large island off the east coast of South Africa. And Madagascar as a country has been devastated by deforestation. So these maps here show a change in deforestation, just bearing in mind that Madagascar was once fully forested, right? All of the pollen records and the sediment records suggest that this was an island once completely covered by forest. But what we've seen over the last 60 to 70 years is a dramatic decline in forest cover in Madagascar, again, for a variety of reasons, to the point that when you look at this space shuttle photograph of the southern part of Madagascar, really what is left in terms of significant forest cover is this thin spine of tropical forests along the eastern flank. And as this country has been deforested, the photograph on the left here is showing the impact on soil erosion and soil loss, right? Remember, this is a system regulator. So when we looked at that first kind of conceptual infographic, that dealt with that aspect. So, you know, Madagascar is often looked at as a critical kind of test bed country in terms of deforestation and the loss of biodiversity. I'll talk about another one in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this first part up here on rates of deforestation and some, you know, the sort of geographic regions before we then try and get to perhaps a more complicated topic, which is why is this happening? You know, so what's going on? So this is one of these generalized maps, and what we're showing here in this generalized map is an estimate of what scientists believe to be the original extent of global forests. This is not just tropical rainforests, of course. This is forests globally, as you can see in the light green. And as of 2014, 2015, what at that point was the current forest cover, right? So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these regions. There's obviously including Madagascar. So you can see the great forests of Africa, tropical Africa, and just outside of that, dramatically impacted, right? Look at the South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and now coming down into Borneo and that region over there, dramatically deforested. Obviously, this is a legacy of a change in agriculture in, Western Europe. And yeah, we focused on Brazil as an enormous volume of forest loss. But relatively speaking, right, the Amazon is still relatively, intact. Remember that diagram, and I'm going to show you that again in just a little bit of the percentage of 1970 forest cover. We've lost something like 20% of the Amazon since 1970, right? Any thoughts or comments there? So try and just sort of, imprint that, keep that in the back of your minds as we go through the next topic.
Hey, Dr. Slater, I had a question.
Yes, Ahmad, let's go back. Fire away.
How much of the Amazon rainforest can we lose before things get more catastrophic?
Great question. We don't know, and it's a great question, and I guess it depends on what we define as catastrophic, right? Catastrophic in terms of species loss, catastrophic in terms of oxygen supply, the hydrologic cycle. To be honest, I haven't seen anything published that points that as a specific number. We've lost 20%. Is 25% catastrophic? I think clearly 50% would be, by any definition, catastrophic. But I guess I don't know. I haven't seen anything that quantifies that, right? It's a difficult question to answer. And it comes back, I think, Ahmad, to implicit in that is, how do we define those boundaries? How do we define these so-called tipping points beyond which, we cannot recover? Good question. And a completely unsatisfactory answer, probably, right?
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, tough one. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. All right. Let's talk about what's driving this, right? Why are we seeing this ongoing destruction of our forests, be they tropical rainforests, primary forests, the boreal forests of Canada, or whatever the case may be? This is a very complicated picture, okay? And let me stop there for a second. And I don't want to put anyone on the spot here, but I am going to try and let me just ask a question. Rafael, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. I don't want to put you on the spot, Rafael, but Rafael is a student in the class. And where are you from again, Rafael?
From Brazil.
Rafael's from Brazil. You should be giving this lecture, my friend. Anything resonate with you at the moment, or do you want me to keep going? The reason why I raise this, Rafael, is, I'm a big believer of not pretending to be an expert in an area where I'm not an expert. So as we talked about yesterday, when you came to see me, I've been to Brazil, but is there anything that you can think about at the moment before we talk about direct drivers? Is deforestation that has impacted you or family or friends personally, or is this something that is more kind of distant away from Sao Paulo? Do you feel like commenting?
Like, I know, like, deforestation now in Brazil is a big problem, like in Amazonas, but doesn't impact me directly because I live in São Paulo, like it's very far away. But like the media there in Brazil is also complaining about the president because of the deforestation he's allowing there. And I know that's a big problem in Amazonas now.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Yeah, I really didn't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but I feel as you're from there, it would be. I was thinking about this last night. Let me ask Rafael if there's, if there's anything that has impacted him personally. But yeah, I think that's the sense, right? There's a sense, certainly among, from what I read, among the Brazilian population that they recognize that this is a significant issue. And I'll touch on maybe the President Bolsonaro as we talk a little bit about the direct drivers here of what's going on. Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
This is a complicated package, right? The one area of the world in the tropics that I have some experience, having traveled there, I don't know, probably 40 times, is Costa Rica. And we have a research station in the rainforest there that I spend a lot of time at. So talking to people on the ground in Costa Rica, I know Costa Rica clearly is not Brazil, and it's not Borneo, and it's not Ghana. Each country has its own set of constraints and challenges and biological resources. But the Costa Ricans realize that the rainforest is a vast, immense natural resource, both for tourism, both from a utilitarian perspective, lumber, all of the reasons why we should preserve these forests. And yet people still cut down forests. So this comes under this umbrella of the drivers, right? And when we look at what's driving deforestation, there are direct drivers. Sometimes these are referred to as the agents, the things that are doing it, right? And then there are the indirect drivers, kind of sort of underlying socioeconomic reasons. But let's just talk about the direct drivers of deforestation at the moment. And I'm going to keep this at a very kind of broad, general level, regionally, okay? The number one driver for deforestation is the conversion of forests to crops and pasture. That's the bottom line, right? So removing trees and planting crops and grass for raising cattle and sheep. So the conversion of large-scale forests to pasture and to cropland. That's the most significant and direct driver of deforestation. And that occurs on two scales, right? One scale we've already talked about, subsistence farming, right? So the herringbone pattern of cutting down trees to go and get small areas to raise crops. So subsistence, shifting agriculture. And then the other scale, of course, is large plantation farming, right? Commercial farming, both again for pasture and for cropland, right? So those are the two major drivers of deforestation globally. And three commodities are really driving this, right? There are three commodities that drive this large-scale conversion of forests into agriculture, be it crops or pasture. One is soybeans, okay? The other is cattle, and then the next is palm oil, right? These are the big three commodities that drive deforestation. And what you're looking at here is a photograph of an oil palm plantation. And these three commodities are quite regionally specific. In other words, when you look at deforestation in parts of Asia, and let's say India in particular, cattle's not an issue there, right? Because they don't raise cattle for pasture there, right? Soybeans in Southeast Asia, in Borneo, is not an issue. That's not what they're farming, but palm oil is, right? So these three commodities vary depending on where you're looking, right? So soybeans, cattle, and palm oil. So let me just very briefly here touch on each of these three. Soybeans is largely, by far, a South America phenomenon, and largely in Brazil and Argentina, but also in the US, right? Now, the US also has much more vigorous reforestation programs, but for now, the point is the conversion of forests into commercial scale soybeans really occurs in these three countries, and predominantly, oh, there's a bad typo, I apologize, Rafael. Brazil does not have another A in there, Brazil and Argentina. So this image on the left here is a satellite image, and you'll see in the textbook where this is from, in Amazonas. And these large areas, these large white gray areas here, are all large-scale commercial soybean plantation. The red, incidentally, is vegetation. So the satellite has just been enhanced, the color's been changed. So what you're seeing here on the right is an aerial photograph. The green is the forest, that would be equivalent to the red on the left. And these are the areas that have been cleared for commercial soybean production, right? There's lots of really great articles. I don't know, I subscribe to National Geographic because I'm a bit nerdy. And there's been lots of really good articles in the last 5 years or so on soybean production in South America and how that has impacted deforestation. Soybeans are also used, if you can remember back to our very short discussion on biofuels, soybeans are grown to create biofuels, right? So to create biodiesel. The soybeans is a major commodity. I'm just going to overlay here. I've brought in this diagram again of annual deforestation rates in the Amazon. And I think this is really kind of interesting because if we go back here to 2006, I'm just going to highlight 2006, and that is that data point there. The Brazilian government put a moratorium on soybean production. And there is a pretty strong argument, and I think a lot of evidence to suggest that once that moratorium on soybean production came into play, in other words, no new deforestation for large-scale soy, what we see here is a decrease in deforestation down to the sort of minimum period in 2012, 2013, 2014. So the moratorium on soybeans was a big player here in, we think, reducing deforestation in the Amazon, right? So I thought that would be worth just mentioning and pointing out. So that's one critical commodity that drives deforestation. All right, here's the other, right? The second big commodity is cattle ranching. Okay, cutting down trees and then converting that into pasture for cattle and sheep and so on. So globally, cattle ranching accounts for 2/3 of all tropical forest loss worldwide, right? Devastating on the land use. And this is almost exclusively Colombia, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil in terms of the global picture of deforestation. Now, here's a diagram here that, and this is as high a res as I could get, but this is a really interesting, I think, diagram. And it was updated in 2018. So let me just explain what we're looking at here. And it's just to make this regional point, right? We're looking here at tree cover loss by the dominant driver. And you can see from this, the years are 2014 to 2018. So we're looking at the drivers of deforestation here. And if you just look at this legend down on the right here, everybody, the colors are red is commodity-driven deforestation, right? The big commodities here are soybeans and cattle in this part of the world, right? The third big commodity, palm oil, there's some here, but we'll shift that across to Southeast Asia in just a bit. So red, for all intents and purposes, is soybean and cattle. The yellow here is the shifting agriculture, right? This is the swidden or the slash and burn agriculture. And then there's some other things here that are much less significant. So when you look at this map here, it's really the red that jumps out, right? The red that jumps out in Argentina, right? So northern Argentina, huge cattle here, okay? Paraguay, right over here, very intensive deforestation going on here for cattle. Colombia, up in the northwest there, and of course Brazil, right? These are the four big regional areas in terms of cattle ranching, okay? So this is not the herringbone pattern, right? This is not shifting agriculture, moving into the forests on a sort of 2 to 3 hectare basis. This is large-scale commercial cattle. So here is the example. So this is Paraguay. In the bottom left of the image here, everyone, you can see I've colored in Paraguay, and the little box there is the region that we're looking at. So this is a subtropical region of forests and savannas that have been cleared for cattle ranching. These are large big areas of deforestation, right? If you're trying to get a sense of scale, I know it's hard here. I'm going to put 2 red dots here. The red dot on the left is Fort Worth. The red dot on the right is downtown Dallas, right? That'll give you a sense of what we're talking at here. So this whole region in the center here, right? Let me see if this, well, blue will have to work. This whole region, that would be like driving from Fort Worth to downtown Dallas, right? And all of this would be enormous areas of cattle ranching clearing, right? Arlington, Mansfield, all gone. If that kind of helps to contextualize the scale over which we're talking. I know it's very hard to sort of wrap one's head around something going on in another part of the world. Okay, so that's the second big commodity is cattle ranching. And then there's this, right? Then there's soybeans, sorry, not soybeans, palm oil, right? And there's a reason why I actually chose palm oil. The picture of palm oil is the picture on the front of the book, partly because I've been to Borneo, the island of Borneo, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Kingdom of Brunei. But it's just so stark what's going on in this part of the world in terms of deforestation. So here's a picture of palm oil in the front. In the left-hand side here, you see the remnants of a tropical forest. And this is a monoculture, right? So palm oil is you plant these row upon row upon row of palm, particular palm species, and then you harvest the fruit off there to process and to create the oil. And this goes into a wide variety of products. This is not just going into cooking oil, right? If you took the time and walked up and down the stores at Tom Thumb or Target or Costco, wherever you shop, you'll see just how much palm oil goes into a whole variety of products, right? From oils to makeups to anything in between. So where's this happening? So palm oil at a commodity, the kind of poster country for palm oil, it really is Borneo, right? So this is the 3rd largest island in the world, something like that. So this is in Southeast Asia, the island of Borneo, and we've got Indonesia and Malaysia and the island of the Kingdom of Brunei here just up in the corner. And what I wanted to show here on this diagram in Borneo is, so the green here are obviously the forests, right? There's various types of forests. There's also these light blues, which are mangrove forests and peaty swampy forests, right? But the point is just look at 1973 and then look at 2018 here, right? You look at a region that you see down here that has been catastrophically deforested, except for this little spine and spindle over here on Borneo. And this is predominantly the clearing of forests in Borneo for palm oil, right? If you're trying to get a sense of scale, I've laid Texas over Borneo here to scale. So that's exactly the size of Borneo in relation to Texas. This is a big island. And in the last 20 years, we've lost an area of forest in Borneo that equates to this circle over here. Again, I'm not going to bog you down in specific percentages and numbers. Suffice it to say that we're looking at an area the size of East Texas that has been cleared for palm oil production in Borneo. Pretty catastrophic, right? So palm oil is one, and then there's also pulpwood concessions as well, right? So on the left here is the diagram of Borneo, and anything in these kind of dark charcoaly black shaded areas all around are pulpwood and palm oil concessions. This has a devastating impact on species. And this one in particular, right? We see a lot of this in the media, the magnificent species, the orangutan, which is endemic to the island of Borneo. And estimates put, at least 100,000 of these have been killed through the deforestation and the conversion of tropical forests into palm oil and pulpwood plantations. So there is that link, and that's why we'll talk about biodiversity next, okay? So the big 3 commodities then of soybeans, cattle ranching, and palm oil are what are the most significant drivers of deforestation. But of course, this also occurs on the scale of subsistence agriculture, right? So here's another picture. This is a very large geographic region. If you go back to the book and you look at the general location of where this is, I'm going to include this here. What we're looking at here is a satellite image of the Amazon And all of this area that I'm just circling here, all of this lighter area here is area that has been cleared and deforested. And each of the red dots here, everybody, is a forest fire or a cluster of forest fires on a particular day. Up the north here, this is all cloud, right? So that's cloud, but these are all fires down here that I'm trying to circle over here. And you can see that on the right-hand side here. This is very typical of a subsistence agriculture plot, right? So here's the herringbone pattern starting, okay? There's one that's been cleared here, and here's about a, 3 to 4 hectare area on the right here. So again, just to try and give you a visual, right, for what's going on, all right? Oh, there's Texas to give you a sense of scale again. And then finally, everybody, we can't forget logging, right? We've talked about the 3 big commodities: palm oil, soybeans, and cattle ranching. Of course, forests are still cleared for wood products, and that is for pulp and timber. So wood products to make paper and wood products to make furniture and other things like that, right? This, of course, includes also, deforestation for burning biomass. This occurs a lot in many countries in Africa. Small-scale deforestation for burning biomass. So those are the drivers, right? The direct drivers. There's a really interesting paradox here that I just wanted to mention, and it's the paradox on tropical soils, right? I think a lot of people, I don't know how you feel, but a lot of people find or think that because you're walking through a tropical rainforest, that soils are incredibly rich in terms of nutrients. I know my students, when I take them through the rainforests of Costa Rica, we spend some time talking about this. You're looking around at all these incredible trees, and they generally assume that the soils underneath tropical rainforests are very, very rich in nutrients. And in fact, the opposite is the case, right? On the left here is a photograph of a typical prairie soil, right? This is a photograph taken in northern Kansas. It's not my photograph, it's one from the US Department of Agriculture. But this is your typical prairie soil where we grow corn and other things in the breadbasket of the United States. What's going on here, right? You've got a topsoil here and a nice, thick, rich, right? So we've got 2.5 feet here of rich organic material that decomposes and breaks down and has time to accumulate in that soil, right? Because the rainfall is not very high, and you get a winter and you get a summer, and the climate here in the Midwest is conducive to nutrients and organic material building up in that soil. On the right is a typical tropical soil, right? Tropical soils are typically nutrient poor. They're kind of these reddish, brownish soils, and they're nutrient poor. So how does that work? How can you have a nutrient poor tropical soil, yet it can sustain all of this incredible biodiversity? Well, the reason for that is that all of that nutrient cycling in tropical soils goes on at the surface, right? It all goes on at the surface. All of that nutrient cycling occurs within the vegetation layer. So yeah, you can walk around a forest soil and you've got lots of leaves and thick vegetation at the surface, but that material decomposes very, very quickly. Why? Because you've got high temperatures and you've got plentiful rainfall, right? Think about a tropical forest. It's warm and it's wet, right? So lots of rainfall and warm temperatures. What does that do? That cycles the nutrients and prevents organic material from building up in the soil. And this is one of the great challenges with deforestation, especially as it comes to shifting agriculture, to those wooden shifting agriculturalists. Why? Because they'll come in, they'll chop out a hectare, they'll burn it down, and then they'll grow a crop. And those nutrients will be high for a year or two, and then they all get washed away, and you've got to move on to another area, and you cut another area and another area, and so on, right? That's why shifting agriculture is just simply not sustainable, because the soils themselves are nutrient poor. I can't forget about Costa Rica, one of my favorite countries. I just want to reiterate that Costa Rica is in many ways such a success story when it comes to tropical deforestation. this set of slides here shows just how dramatic the deforestation in Costa Rica was. So this is an estimate of forest cover in 1940 and where the forests were in 1977 down here. You can see it's a massively fragmented ecosystem, right? At one point in the 1980s, Costa Rica had 25% of its land surface covered with forests. 75% have gone, right? This is 2005. Right now, as of 2018, Costa Rica's forest cover is above 50% for the first time, right? Through a series of really important government and private and non-profit incentives to not continue to cut down trees. And I'd like you to read this on your own time, right? One of the interesting programs in Costa Rica, incidentally, everybody, is a system called the PES. The PES is a government-supported system. It's called Payment for Ecosystem Services. And what the government does is they come to you if you're a landowner and they say, we will pay you. I think the current rate is, it's not going to seem very high, but the current rate is about $64 per hectare if you do not cut down that forest. In other words, if you preserve the area of land, don't convert it into something else, the government will pay you that, right? Per hectare on an ongoing basis. And so that has actually proven to be enormously successful over and above just the ethics of not cutting down trees. And of course, again, we have to just remind ourselves, I think, about this explicit link of species diversity and the richness of these tropical forests, not just from an ecosystem species service standpoint, but also from a tourism standpoint. And here are just 6 pictures that I've taken over the years there of some of my favorite little species in Costa Rica. Okay, so that's a little bit about the direct drivers. Then, of course, there's the indirect drivers. So let me just wrap this up in the next 5 or so minutes. The indirect drivers, right, are not the commodities, right? They're not the slash and burn agriculturalists. They're not conversion into cropland or into pasture. It's the underlying socioeconomic, geographical drivers, right? Why is deforestation ongoing? Why do we still see forest loss, right? So it's really complicated. There's a really easy, far too easy link. It's often made, I think, between poverty and overpopulation, right? The majority of the world's tropical forests reside in countries that are developing, okay, or further down, lagging behind on the development scale. So, and I read that a lot. I see people talking about, well, these are poor countries, they can't afford to protect their trees, and poverty and overpopulation, right? That's far too simplistic. So let's look, for example, at the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this would support this hypothesis, right? The Democratic Republic of Congo, as we just saw a few minutes ago, is the second highest country in terms of the loss of tropical primary forests. 2018, DRC lost 481,000 hectares, okay, in Africa. The DRC is also, if you go back to chapter 2 and think about population growth, it's one of the countries that is expected to have one of the highest projected increases in population to 2100, right? So a dramatically expanding population. So population density is high, poverty is relatively high, cutting down trees is high, right? Then we come back to the beautiful country of Brazil, Rafael's home country, right? In terms of population density, Brazil only ranks about 153rd in the world, right? Brazil's a very, very large country, okay? So this notion of poverty and overpopulation is too simplistic for sure. If you're interested, everybody, I can give you lots of different readings on the complexity of forest loss. Suffice it to say at this point that there are a multitude of reasons, right, why deforestation goes on. One of which is unequal land distribution. Certainly in the Amazon and in other parts of South America, okay, there's an enormous inequity in land distribution, right? There's big commercial farmers that own something like 3/4 of all the farmland, but small sort of mom and pop farming operations are few and far between, right? Western consumption, for sure, okay? Cattle ranching, remember, is the most significant driver of deforestation. 2/3, again, of all tropical forest loss is due to cattle ranching, right? And again, you know, that tropical beef, okay? And there's lots of work being done on trying to put moratoriums on beef ranching. Incidentally, Brazil did that back in 2008, a moratorium on beef from deforested land, okay? And as Rafael mentioned, we've started to see an increase in deforestation in Brazil, and a lot of people are pointing to the government and Bolsonaro for encouraging increasing land use change, getting back onto deforesting for cattle production and soybeans and so on. So Western consumption, right? There's certainly corruption, no doubt about it, right? Money, how that money flows, and the money to be made in forest. Remember our conversation early on, everybody, when we looked at that beautiful scene in Costa Rica, and I said, how do you, what is the instrumental value of that landscape? Yeah, it's instrumental value in these forests, and, money corrupts. And of course, profit-driven multinational companies, right? So there's a whole intertwined complexity as to why forests are being cut down. There's also, international debt. Many of these countries are sort of sinking under the inability to pay back their debt, right? So we sit here in the quote unquote West or the first world with our consumption habits, and invariably those pressures are felt in the tropical forests. How do we solve this? What do we do? I think there's two things that need to happen here in terms of beginning to significantly reduce deforestation. This is obviously one of them, is to try and preserve as much as we can, as quickly as we can, right? So to preserve intact sections of forest, right? Preserve sections of tropical forest intact. There's a lot of wonderful work being done by nonprofits around the world. Organizations like the Nature Conservancy, for example, the World Wildlife Fund, individual corporations, rich people. One of my favorite musicians is Sting. He does a lot of work in the Amazon in terms of trying to preserve communities and tropical forests. And we also have to preserve forests and keep in mind this notion of edge communities and disturbance. So, so that's one of the big drivers, is to try and buy land and encourage governments and reduce foreign debt, do whatever it takes to try and preserve intact communities. So on the one hand, it's protect as much as we can. On the other hand, is we have to address the economics, right? The economics of these countries that are still developing, right? In which the tropical forests reside, okay? So yeah, we have to implement these broad scale strategies, I think, of preserving forests, but you have to then go back to the locals on the ground and what the environmental and the economic constraints on the ground are. If we don't address those two simultaneously, i.e. protecting and also the economic needs of these countries, I think we're going to be in trouble for quite some time to come. So there's the sunset slide, everybody. This is another photograph taken in Borneo. There's Mount Kinabalu in the distance. And that's what an oil palm plantation looks like in the early stages of clearing and planting. What are we doing on time? Okay, cool, 8:50. Let me stop there and see if you have any questions or comments before we go on to talk about biodiversity. Thoughts, everybody? Questions, comments? All good. Okay, all right, so that's deforestation. Let's take a little break here, 8:49. Let's come back at 9 and we'll look at biodiversity, okay? And the biodiversity, I'm not going to rush through this, but I'm going to see where we get into the biodiversity, but we're going to spend a little bit of time early on talking about one of the most important theories of biodiversity, and then we'll start looking at some individual issues. Let me put the recording on. Okay, everybody, let's move on to the material in chapter 8 here on biological diversity. So this is a topic that, again, is pretty close to my heart, as I've mentioned when we first met, sort of 3 weeks ago now, that I've been involved in a rhino conservation program here in South Africa for about the last 6 or so years. I'm not a wildlife biologist. I grew up around those species, and as a young person and teenager, as I mentioned, my dad would take me multiple times a year into the national parks and the game reserves to, to spend time with these amazing animals. So this is something that I'm sort of, that's part of me and grew up with and love talking about. And so that's where we're headed for the next 45, 50 minutes or so. Biodiversity. And I know the sort of add-on sentence here may seem a little kind of heartless, but I've got it there for a particular reason, and that is why we should care. And the kind of open-ended question at this point is, can we afford to save the world's species? Can we afford to save our natural heritage? And can we afford not to? Right? What would happen if we just ignored this and species loss continued at these unprecedented rates that I think they are? So again, there's lots tied up in here. There's, as I mentioned, an intimate link between forest cover and habitat and species loss and climate change and so on, right? So let's just launch on in and talk about biodiversity, biological diversity here for a bit. Very common headline, right? And you'll see here the general headline here is the 6th mass extinction. We have had, as I'll show you, and when you look at, when you look at the chapter heading here, it's called this, biodiversity, the 6th mass extinction. And the reason for that is that the geologic record indicates that we have had 5 periods in our Earth history where we have had catastrophic loss of species. Those 5 were all natural. The argument here is that we are not likely to experience, but that we are experiencing rates of extinction that are unprecedented. So that's why many people talk about the 6th mass extinction, right? And these headlines are, yeah, they can be quite dramatic, but I think people are now really beginning to realize, because this is something that we actually can measure to some extent. How many species are we losing? And I say to some extent because there are some caveats there that we'll talk about. So if we're going to think about saving the world's natural heritage, we probably need to have some idea as to how many species there are, right? So what is it that we're trying to save here? How many? And then, of course, some difficult ethical questions about which one should we put the emphasis on. So how many species are there on the planet? Simple answer is we don't know, okay? Because there, for a variety of reasons. One is there are large areas, believe it or not, of the planet that remain unexplored, and in particular the deep oceans. So that's kind of a black box that we haven't really opened up yet in terms of biodiversity. The other complexity is, our advances in DNA and species identification has been relatively recent, and so we're learning a lot about new species as we move on. But currently, there are somewhere between 1.7 to 1.9 million named species that have been identified and cataloged and put in the various repositories around the world and libraries and so on. And it depends on which one you look at in terms of those numbers, but somewhere less than 2 million species have been named and identified. 70% of those are invertebrates, right? So it's often the small and what appears to be inconsequential species, which they are not, but those are the ones that have tended to be in the attention. How many species are we likely to have? This is a topic that has kind of bemused and befuddled biologists and ecologists for a very long time. We don't know, right? We have to make estimates based on species loss and speciation and evolution and so on. You know, you see estimates of somewhere between 3 and 50 million could be alive on this planet. I think the ecological consensus is moving towards somewhere in the region of 7 to 8 million, somewhere in there. So the bottom line is we've probably only identified about a quarter, maybe a bit more, maybe a third of all the species that are alive on this planet, right? So that's a challenge, right? Okay. Yeah, we know more or less how many different species of rhino there are, an elephant, big glamorous megafauna. But biodiversity is such an enormously complicated topic to tackle. And part of that complexity lies in the slide, is that we have yet to identify all the species that are on this planet, right? The only other thing I'd comment here, because I've got it up on the slide here, everybody, is that when we think of North America, this vast area, it's not a particularly rich and diverse part of the planet. Somewhere between 10 to 15% of the species live in North America. So when we think about finding new species, you know, perhaps we have this image of Harrison Ford with his Indiana Jones hat and his machete cutting through jungle to find remarkable new species. But as I said, a lot of this discovery has come about through genetics, right? Genetic studies. For example, we thought there was just one species of giraffe. We now know there are 4 distinct species of giraffe based on their genetics and their DNA. And so that is sort of illuminating a lot more of the complexity in speciation. So that's just some general. All right. So here's an important map, everyone. It's a very high likelihood you're going to see this again next week on Thursday morning. Because, and the reason for me saying that is that this map captures one of the most important ecological concepts, right? And that is this richness that we find, species richness, species diversity that we find, and how that is distributed across the planet. So what are we looking at here? And then I'd like someone to begin to talk to me a little bit about what we're seeing. So the colors here represent diversity zones, right? And these diversity zones, as you go from the very light yellows and through the greens and then into the reds, we are increasing the number of species. And this incidentally, I should have made that comment. This is just plant species, right? The number of plant species per 10,000 square kilometers, right? So it's a density of plant species. So this is the most intense and most diverse zone. This is diverse zone number 10. That is more than 5,000 plant species per 10,000 square kilometers. In other words, for every 2 square kilometers, there's a new and different species, right? Notice also over here, we've got the, in gray, an estimate of sea surface temperatures, 27 degrees and 29 degrees Celsius. So the question I want a bit of feedback on this, I want you to start thinking about this, is what do you notice, right? What can you say about species diversity across the planet? What jumps out at you? Talk to me about the patterns that we see here. Anybody, before I pick on someone?
It's a lot more diverse, like towards the equator.
Okay. So that's the right off the bat, that's the most important, right? Thanks, Mary Morgan. So diversity in the equator, right? So here's the equator here, right? Cuts right through Central Africa. There's the equator there. This is 20 degrees north, right? So there's 20 degrees north, there's 20 degrees south. Incidentally, I probably should have made this comment in the deforestation talk. When we talk about the tropics, okay, we've got the tropics up here at 23.5 degrees north, right? The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So technically, in terms of latitude, the tropics would be this band here between 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south, okay? Some people also say, well, we should probably include the subtropics, which is up at about 30 degrees, something like that. So that's where we're talking about. Oh, and incidentally, think about this, right? When we look at this diagram, okay, let's just take the tropics. So if we're taking 23.5 degrees north and south, let's do that, okay? That area on the planet, okay, covers 40% of the surface of planet Earth. Think about that for a second. You may not, you may not have appreciated that before. The surface area of the quote unquote tropics between 23.5 degrees north and south covers 40% of the surface of planet Earth. If we include up to 30 degrees north and south, right, that becomes 50% of the surface of the Earth, because the Earth is a sphere, right? And as you move from the tropics towards the poles, the land area gets smaller and smaller. Right, so let's go back to your comment, Mary Morgan. First point, nicely pointed out. Okay, seems to be high in close to the equator. What else, everybody?
It tends to be where the tropical rainforests are.
Okay. Yep. So if we overlay the tropical rainforest, we would probably come back into this region here. Yeah, this region here, this region here. So the tropics and the tropical rainforests, which are the most diverse ecosystem, right? More than 50% of all the world's species live in the tropical rainforest. The tropics are where it's at a kind of, 40,000 foot level. Why do you think that is? Why are the tropics so diverse? That's one question I want you to think about. And the second one is, if latitude was the only control, right? Think about this, everybody. If the latitude was the only control, in other words, 0 degrees, 20, 40, 60, if latitude was the only control, what would this map look like? Ooh, this is an exam question for you. So why are the tropics so diverse, and what would this look like if latitude were the only control? Thoughts?
Well, for why it's so biodiverse, I would say like probably because it's a pretty consistent temperature year round.
Okay,
and
good.
A lot of sunshine and humidity.
Okay, so why is that important, Mary Morgan? And you're correct.
The plants will be able to photosynthesize like year round. And Yep. Pretty optimal conditions, right? Okay. Temperature and rainfall, two fundamental drivers of speciation, the creation of different habitats, climate, yeah. So you've got warmth, high rates of metabolism, metabolic functioning, high rates of photosynthesis. You've got lots of rainfall, right? Pretty optimum conditions. So climate is a significant driver, because remember, in our discussions of climate change, right, the tropics are always in an energy surplus. There's always plenty of energy in the tropics because the sun's rays are directly overhead between 23.5 degrees north and south at some point of the year, right? So this is a neat place in terms of microclimates and habitat and so on, rainfall and temperature. What else? It's not just climate, that's clearly the most significant, right? The surface area is important, okay? So the tropics cover 40% of the surface of the planet, right? So there's lots of geographic area there for species to operate in. But is latitude the only control here? And if it was, what would the biodiversity map look like? And if you're struggling with that question, and I want you to, there's a particular place on this map that is a great indication of what the map would look like
if latitude was the only control on biodiversity. In other words, if it only depended on where you were geographically relative to the equator, then there's a region that really jumps out as being typical for latitude being the only control. Let's see if anyone can find that. Where would you think that would be? Don't be shy or embarrassed to be wrong.
Antarctica.
Mary Morgan, say again.
Antarctica.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I can't argue with that. Let's forget about Antarctica for a moment, because we've just got, we've just got so few plants there, right? But okay, I wasn't expecting that answer. Technically, you're not wrong, but think about outside of Antarctica. I love that you're thinking. Where else, if latitude was the only control? Where would you say? Oh, it's a great little map, this.
Wouldn't, if latitude being like really close to the equator, wouldn't Asia be less diverse than it is?
Okay, keep going, man.
So, between India and China, there's almost the highest concentration of diversity, yet they're, would say, north of the equator by, a significant margin, and its relative comparison across the rest of the globe is not as diverse.
Okay.
In that area.
All right. So you're coming at it from a slightly different angle, but I hate to use this analogy with you, Matthew, but you're in the ballpark here, right? So what's going on here? This is the region you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. What's going on there?
Obviously, a lot of development in species.
So there's very high speciation, right? High intensity. One of the most diverse, intensely diverse zones in the world. Why there? And incidentally, Matt, you're coming at it from an interesting angle, because that's an example of latitude not being the only control.
Does it have to do with sea surface temperature?
Not specifically there, Rada, but sea surface temperatures are important in this map for sure, right? Sea surface temperatures are important in the map. And I'll point out a couple of places where that's true in just a second. Anywhere else on this map that looks as weird and odd as this region over here that Matt has been talking about? This area, India, China. Where else do you see something like that going on?
Maybe South America.
Okay, Kylie. Yeah, where?
Like towards the top, also attached, I think, like the Yucatan Peninsula,
Right,
like that whole region.
right. And then down here and down here. What is going on there?
The Andes Mountains.
There you go. So why are mountains important, Cole? What do you think? And any mountains here? Back in the map?
Himalayas.
Himalayas. And at a much less diverse, what's going on here? This is a funky little horseshoe.
Rockies.
There go the Rockies. And here?
The Mojave. Oh,
Yeah, Mojave Desert's there, but the California mountain ranges stretching up to the Pacific Northwest, right? Okay, mountains are a significant control over species diversity. Okay? If latitude was the only control, In other words, if I flattened out this entire planet and there were no mountains on this planet, then the species diversity map, and if we just ignored Irada's variable of sea surface temperature, right? But if there were no mountains and latitude was the only control, then the diversity map would look like this up here, right? The lines of diversity would more or less mimic the lines of latitude. Everybody see that? Okay. Messed up a little bit over here over Canada because we've got this bulge going on here in the Rockies, right? But if latitude was the only control, you would have diversity lines that more or less mimicked latitude, right? As you started at the equator, you would have very high diversity. And as you move towards the poles, you would have low diversity. And that pattern, right? That pattern that we see is one of the most recognizable patterns in ecology, and it's called the LDG, the latitudinal diversity gradient, right? The latitudinal diversity gradient, where we have high diversity in the tropics and low diversity towards the poles. Folks, intuitively that feels right, right? So here's two photographs that I've taken. On the left, a picture in the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica. On the right, Vatnajökull National Park in Iceland. Which one is more diverse, do you think, from a species perspective? Plants. Well, it's going to be Costa Rica, right? If we go back to the map here, okay, here's Costa Rica. Let me just get rid of that. Here's Costa Rica over here, right, on the isthmus, and it is in this red zone over here, right? Costa Rica is here, red. Iceland, yellow, down here, okay? They're at very different latitudes, 10 degrees, 62 degrees. So that gradient in diversity jumps out to you at a very simplified scale if you're just looking at latitude. Does that make sense? We go back to the question of climate, right? Temperature and what Mary Morgan said, temperature and rainfall, optimal conditions. So that gradient is something that is very significant in ecology. And let me just show you two examples. I've taken this from two different papers to just kind of expound upon this latitudinal diversity gradient in terms of birds on the left and mammals on the right. So, and I know the scale here is really odd. I didn't want to change this. This is directly from the academic paper, but this is the number of species of birds, okay, per 611,000 square kilometers. I have no idea why they decided on 611,000 square kilometers. They did, and so we're going to go with it, right? So it's just a concentration of bird species from 80 degrees south to 80 degrees north, right? And that's what it looks like. The number of bird species. The highest species density occurs in and around the equator, depending on where you are and where the land masses are, okay? And the lowest diversities of birds occur at higher latitudes. Does that make sense, everybody? Right? So we're looking at birds here and not just vascular plants. There's a whole bunch of noise here, for sure. You may be operating in a particular part of the world that has high diversity and or low diversity because of other things. Maybe there's ocean currents that bring cold water that changes the situation, and ocean currents are an important driver as well, right? But the overall trend is this diversity gradient of high species diversity in the tropics and lower towards the poles. We see the same here with American mammals, right? As you go down and a little bit of wiggling around, same sort of pattern, okay? So the latitudinal diversity gradient is a really, really important and significant player and emphasizes that the tropics really are the control. Let me just go back a couple here. I don't want to ignore your question, Irada, on or your comment on sea surface temperatures, because it is important, right? We've got warm water here in the tropics, and that does impact biodiversity significantly. And we've got cold currents and warm currents that impact biodiversity. Incidentally, this is a really unique floral kingdom along the southern coast of South Africa, where I was walking around just last month, right? That's a particular floristic kingdom. It's one of the 6 kingdoms, and it's known as the fynbos, the fine bush. It's a very unique system that has developed there over time, right? So latitude is not the only control. You can clearly see that mountains are significant. Why are mountains so diverse? I forgot to mention that. Why are mountains this repository of biodiversity? How does that work? Because what mountains do is they take the latitudinal diversity gradient, where it's warm and moist here and cold and dry at the North Pole, and they take that latitudinal diversity gradient and flip it up vertically over a very short distance, right? So you've got a mountain may look like that, and down here it's generally much warmer and moister, and you've got rainfall down here, and up here at the top of the mountain it's cold and dry, and you've probably got tundra conditions. I don't know if any of you have been to, what comes to mind, Maui on the island of Hawaii. If you go up Mount Haleakala, it's a great example. Again, I don't know if any of you have done that, but down here you're in, pineapple plantations, and it's warm and moist, and people are surfing. And up here you've got jackets on, it's much colder, and there's some snow caps at the top of the mountain, right? Same on the Big Island, Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. You frequently see snow there in Hawaii because it takes that latitudinal diversity gradient and flips it vertically. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions on that? Okay. Let me give you another example as to why we think about the tropics as truly the heartland of biodiversity. So both these regions are drawn to scale, okay? So just regionally, there's Australia. So there's Borneo. We talked about that with oil palms. So here's Borneo to its actual size compared to North America to its actual size, right? In one paper, this was in the journal Nature, in one 15-hectare area, so an area that was about 30 football fields, okay, in Borneo, scientists reported about 700 tree species, okay? That's the same number of tree species in the whole of North America. That's what we're talking about in terms of the intensity of diversity, okay? Borneo, incidentally, I just thought this was a fun fact, is also home to the world's tallest tree, right? It's the yellow Moranti, twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. I've seen it. It's pretty awesome, okay? So yeah, there's an enormous diversity around the world. How much, again, we don't know, right? 6, 7, 8, 9 million, we're just not sure. But we do come back to this issue of the tropics as truly being the home of the world's species. Here's just another way of portraying the diversity gradient. I thought this might be a kind of fun way to do it. It's from another paper. And the bottom line is, when you're in the reds here in the center, those are high species diversity, right? So again, where Raphael is from, Central Africa, Southeast Asia, that's the latitudinal diversity grading playing out sort of pretty clearly here, I see. Okay, so that's the LDG. Any questions on that before we move on? Makes sense. So it's not just latitude, but that's the overall driver, temperatures and rainfall. All good. Okay. So given this that we've talked about, right? The fact that populations are going up dramatically, and that the fact that we'll probably be somewhere at about 9.5 billion people by 2050, and probably 10.5 to 10.9 by 2100, right? So that's a given. And we've talked about the age structure diagrams and total fertility rates and why that's going to happen. So if we take that as a given, and if this is a given, which is the conversion of land for crops, and this just goes for 1800 to 1900 to 2000, right? The conversion of our land into cropland and pasture. So a growing population and an increasing pressure on our land, right? The question is, how do we save these? how do we take a step back and think about the conservation of wildlife, right? And I don't just mean, when I say these, I don't just mean elephants. I mean our natural heritage, right? Species, biological diversity, and not just the big glamorous megafauna like elephants, all of it, right? How do we save and preserve and conserve for us and for future generations the natural world, given the pressures of population growth and given the pressures of having to feed that population and get energy to that population. And I suppose this kind of human desire to constantly improve and consume and improve and consume, right? A rather sobering report that came out by the World Wildlife Fund called the Living Planet Report. This is one headline from that report. We, all of us in this class, not me as a professor and you as students, but we as humanity are apparently the last generation that can save nature, okay? You know, whether you believe that or not, I don't know, but it was quite a sobering headline for me when I think about what I've witnessed in terms of habitat fragmentation and deforestation and consumption and the illegal trafficking of wildlife and all of the stuff that goes into trying to save our future. It becomes really, really challenging, right? It's a massive ask. It's a very heavy lift that we're looking at. So if we're going to succeed, everybody, right? If we are going to try and save nature and save wildlife for whatever reason, right? Whether it's an altruistic reason, whether it's a utilitarian pragmatic reason, whether it's, Matt, you and I were talking about this, once you've had kids, I can only speak for myself, that changes, it changed me, it changes the way in which I thought about things like, you know, rhinos and elephants. That may seem very kind of self-serving, I know, but it just is what it is. How do we do this? How do we balance this all and save nature? Well, it's interesting that for me personally, that one of my professors in England ended up being, was a guy who was enormously influential in the world of biodiversity. And he came up with this notion of, one, we cannot do this, right? There's not enough money, there's not enough resources, and the pressures on our planet are too high. We cannot just save everything. So we have to try and identify those parts of the world where we should be spending our conservation dollars. And his name was Norman Myers, M-Y-E-R-S. Norman passed away last year. Really fascinating scientist. And he came up with this idea of identifying parts of the planet that he called hotspots, right? Not geologic hotspots like Hawaii, where they're developing under because of lava, but ecological hotspots, right? A hotspot, a place that is so important in terms of biodiversity, that is where we need to put our conservation dollars. These are kind of our first highest priority, if you like, in terms of conservation of biological diversity. So how did Norman define this, right? Well, according to Professor Myers, to qualify as a hotspot, a region must be both irreplaceable and threatened, right? Those are the two words in red that I've listed here. So irreplaceable, the qualifier for being irreplaceable is that the region must have at least 1,500 plants that are endemic, and endemic just means only found there, right? Only there and nowhere else. And threatened meaning that it must have less than 30% of its original natural vegetation in place. In other words, 70% of the vegetation cover must have been lost, right? Now, let me stop there for a second. And this just reminded me, somebody asked, Cole, was it you who asked? No, or was it Ahmad? Somebody asked, Ahmad, I think it might have been you. Did you ask when we were talking about deforestation and we have 80% of the Brazilian Amazon forest left, I think you asked Ahmad, at what percentage does that become irreversible, critical, I think?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So Myers, for a hotspot, his qualifier was 70%, right? There were good reasons for that. There was ecological reasons for that, soil reasons. This wasn't just a number that was sucked out of thin air. But basically, he said, once you've lost 2/3 of your vegetation, you are in real irreversible trouble, right? It's hard to get that back. So that's what qualifies as a hotspot, okay? 1,500 that are endemic, and you must have lost 70% of your vegetation. And so these regions here are, at the time of me printing the book, I don't think this has changed since I last looked. These are currently the world's global hotspots. There are 35 of them around the world that are currently identified as hotspots. They are managed and overseen by a nonprofit called Conservation International, right? So just look at this map. I'm not going to ask you at all to identify particular hotspots, right? But just look at the regions of the world that are currently defined as being a biodiversity hotspot, right? So if we come back to Rafael's home country here, why is the central Amazon not considered a biological hotspot when it's just so important and diverse? Well, because it doesn't qualify, right? Because it still has 80% of its vegetation intact. The Cerrado, on the other hand, is, because that's been decimated, right? In terms of the removal of forest cover, right? Madagascar, same deal. It's a hotspot. It's lost 90% of its forests, okay? And it's got 20,000 species that are endemic, okay? Ecuador, same deal. Huge endemism down there. And this whole region, right, in South and Southeast Asia, okay? That region where there are more people living inside that circle and out of it, that region that is going to account for a dramatic increase in the global population moving forward, right, is all identified as a global hotspot. Does that make sense, everybody? So if you buy into this, these are the regions on the planet that we should be putting our conservation dollars into, right? If you buy into that, okay? So yeah, Minnesota, lovely state, fabulous place, about 1,700 plant species, one is endemic, okay? If we lose that one, yeah, it's gone. Ecuador, haven't been, 20,000 plant species, 4,000 are endemic. Madagascar contains 10% of all the world's species. So this is Myers' central premise, right? Is that there's not enough money to go around. And so the money that we do have probably should not be spent in Southeastern Australia. It should be spent on the Horn of Africa, for example, right? Or in places like Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and so on, right? That are dramatically under the gun in terms of human pressures. Any questions there, anybody? Any thoughts? So let me just finish my train of thought. I'm not necessarily saying that these are the only places that deserve our attention, not at all, right? But these are the places, according to Professor Myers, that if we have limited resources, that we should focus on certainly first. All right, any thoughts? Any comments? All good. Okay. So let's talk about saving the world's species, right? When we first met, and in that first lecture, and I gave you a sense of some of these kind of broader questions, okay? And I used the panda. Let's come back and just use this as to how do we move forward? How are we going to save the world's biodiversity, right? And I think I mentioned, giant pandas, right? These are incredible creatures, okay? Absolutely majestic creatures. I spent a half a day at the Singapore Zoo just observing 3 baby pandas. I couldn't take my eyes off, right? They were ridiculous. They were just so cute and entertaining, okay? But enormously expensive to conserve and save. And would it matter if they went extinct? Would it? If we lost all of the world's pandas, okay? Would life go on? Do you think?
Isn't their primary source of food bamboo, correct?
That's their only source of food.
So realistically speaking, their ecological impact would only be that the bamboo forests would potentially grow more.
Right? Right? Potentially. Unless something else came along or we decided to just kill the bamboo or whatever the case may be. Yeah, so they regulate bamboo. But in the big picture of things,
isn't the bigger question, like when we talk about losing species, is like the snowball effect of losing one to the next? Like we talk about sharks and like how important sharks are to the oceans, and that people want to eliminate sharks, but they don't realize like what the chain reaction would be if we took those out of the water. But like, for instance, pandas, it seems that their cycle is very short and the chain wouldn't be very long.
correct. So that's a fundamental sort of energy thermodynamic ecological question. You're spot on, Matt. I hear the same argument with rhinos, right? Would it matter if we lost all the world's rhinos? Well, the world's ecosystems wouldn't collapse. Now, that would have an impact in African grasslands. The white rhino is a grazer and it walks around and it keeps the grass closed. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the rhino and the oxpecker, right? The bird that feeds off the ticks and keeps the rhino healthy and so on. There would be knock-on effects, but would those effects be knock-on and then, as you say, man, have a short cycle and sort of dissipate out? Right? Or, how do we bring the conversation of ethics into it? Right? So would it matter if pandas disappeared? So many people would say no. But then what does it say about us as a species if we go, you know what? We can't afford to save you. Sorry, you're out. Bam, next, It's tough.
But to an extent, don't we already do that? Like a good example is if you were to use the COVID vaccination distribution, who could get what, the allocation of like it going to the older people first or the people who are more prone. So like there is already a system in which we use there's already a system, I guess, in place that we use for something like that. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And so if I'm understanding you, Ahmad, there's a value-based system in place. Someone gets to make the decision, right? And that depends on your worldview and who gets to make that decision. So yeah, there's a system in place. So if there's a system in place to protect species, is that system not automatically biased towards the big glamorous megafauna? Probably, right? I mean, if I'm trying to raise money, which I do, for say the protection of rhinos or whatever it is, right? I find that there's a connection, there's an automatic kind of visceral connection, someone wanting to help to save rhinos or elephants or leopards or lions. I think I would have a tougher time if I wanted to raise money to save the eel, or something else. And I don't mean to sound kind of sarcastic or glib, because that's not my intention at all, right? Is that what you're getting at, Ahmad, that there's this kind of bias or system, maybe not bias, but a system that dictates, where we put our conservation dollars?
Right, like a hierarchy conservation dollar ordeal. Exactly.
Priorities, right? How do we prioritize that? I mean, yeah, there are aesthetic reasons to save this forest, right? I took this photograph on a cloudy morning in Monteverde. Absolutely magic, magnificent. Birds were singing, frogs were croaking. It was beautiful, right? So you walk through there, and certainly I would argue that there is an argument to be made that we need to preserve this forest because there's just an intrinsic beauty, functioning spirituality to the place, right? Whether you go down, the Muir's aesthetic, moral nature preservation, God's creation line, or just a straightforward, pragmatic, this is cycling water through through the hydrosphere. Yeah, there are aesthetic reasons to save that forest, right? There are aesthetic reasons to save this tiger. Magnificent. I've never worked on a tiger, but I've personally done quite a few procedures on cheetahs and lions. I cannot explain to you what it's like to have your hands inside a lion's mouth, right, whilst it's sleeping. It's a privilege to do that. They're beautiful, majestic creatures, okay? But what happens if you're ugly?
I mean, not to like sound extremely harsh, but based on like what we've been doing as far as like the way that our world has been building and like the backbone that we've used to get there, aren't we kind of past the ability to look at intrinsic value versus practical value, and that our first priority has to be we've got to reverse course, and then once we get into more stable location, we can then look to repopulate or replenish?
Maybe, yep. There's a strong argument to be made there, Matt, for sure, right? But there's no doubt that we tend to go towards the beautiful, right? There's a huge body of literature built around the aesthetics of nature preservation, right? But the fact, if we're going to argue, and this is not the argument that I would make, but this is the argument that many make, that if we're going to argue that, you know, we need to preserve beauty, that's not going to cut it, right? Because there are a whole bunch of animals that are perhaps not as beautiful, but don't they equally deserve? I know this doesn't speak specifically to your comment, Matt, but you know, beauty, I know it's in the eye of the beholder, but beauty in and of itself won't do. There's pragmatic reasons to save nature, right? This is the rosy periwinkle. The rosy periwinkle, which is used in the development of a variety of cancer drugs. Ooh, now we've got, is this useful to us, right? Bioprospecting, making antibiotics and drugs that help humanity. So we need to put our emphasis there first. But what happens to all the species that aren't that useful, right? That don't have cancer-fighting properties? Maybe that argument doesn't hold up. There's a very large body of literature that says, you know what, we need to approach this differently. If we're coming back to this one question of how do we save nature, how do we save our wildlife, there's an argument that we need to look at this from an ecosystem service standpoint, right? That same concept is why I introduced it right at the outset, of sitting on that riverbank in Costa Rica, right? And looking at all the services that, you know, that landscape provides free of charge: the production of oxygen, the cycling of nutrients, the cleansing of water, and so on. I mean, is this creature that you see in front of you more or less important than a rhino? Well, certainly pollinators, we're in dire trouble, okay, if we lose pollinators, right? So what I'm trying to get at is to wrap this up, to give you something to think about before on Monday, I'll need about 20 or 30 minutes to finish this. You know, we look at a landscape to try and preserve this landscape. So we're looking at two elephants here. You know, and how do we save the world's elephants? Well, we can pour huge amounts of conservation dollars into saving these two elephants. But if we take a step back and look at that entire landscape and think about all of the value built around that landscape. So in my part of the world where we take students, it's not just about the elephants and rhinos. It's about all of the jobs that are associated with those game reserves, those nature reserves, the ecotourism industry, right? The money that flows in, the employment that flows in. I'm just suggesting that it's a complicated picture when we think about trying to save the world's species. If you start from a pragmatic standpoint like Norman Myers, let's find those areas that we need to put our conservation dollars in, right? And by golly, it better be areas where there are more than 1,500 endemic species or less than 30% of the vegetation, to perhaps a more holistic, integrated view. So I guess it's not looking at nature for humans, right? Or, you know, humans for nature. It's kind of looking at nature and humans as an integrated whole, if that sort of makes sense. So let me just stop there. We've got 5 minutes left. Let me just see if there are any thoughts or comments or counterbalances to that, because what I want to do on Monday morning is just talk about the threats to biodiversity and wrap up some thoughts on conservation. Comments, questions, thoughts, everybody? Makes sense? I don't know if I threw your comment off kilter there, Matt, but I mean, I agreed fundamentally with what you're saying, for sure.
No, you touched on it just based on with the last picture that it's not
Yeah.
just about, we can't be so tight focused. Like we have to have a wide lens and realize like what the value comes from everything inside of it and what our chain reaction is going to be versus when we're trying to decide what do we need to, where do the dollars need to go now?
Yeah, the depressing news is that the amount of money that is spent on preserving biodiversity, conservation, is very, very small globally. It's less than, it's less than $70 billion, more or less, that gets spent on global conservation, right? Significantly less than that in other countries. But we're throwing hundreds of billions around and trillions and stimulus packages and infrastructure packages and all of that's important for sure. But we're so intimately dependent on the biosphere that if we kind of don't pay attention, it's going to come up and bite us, I think. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. Any other thoughts or comments before I let you run off for lab? All right, so just a quick just reminder, please finish your discussions, make sure you're on top of those, and think about if you need any ideas or thoughts or comments on your op-ed. Incidentally, everybody, I'm more than happy to take a look if you've got a draft or you're pretty close to finishing the op-ed on climate change sometime next week or whenever you are, and I'm happy to take a look at it and give you some ideas and thoughts and edits. So please take advantage of that if you need to. We'll wrap up biodiversity on Monday. We're going to delve into some soils and land degradation and do some water, and then we'll put a bow on this little summer experience. Okay, that's it for today. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.